All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Friday, July 23rd. Thanks for tuning into the show today. Whether you are watching me live or watching the recording back, I appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching the show, I know we're continuing to get new watchers here every day, which is great. This is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, really whatever you guys want to talk about. We get questions in through email, support@sabersim.com. We get questions in live on YouTube chat, and we get questions in our office hours channel on Slack. So I host the show live for a reason. I want live questions. I want follow-up questions. I want clarifying questions from you guys. And I want you guys to be a part of the conversation here too. So if I'm talking about something that you think is interesting and you have 2 cents to throw it in. YouTube chat or office hours channel on Slack are the best places to do that. If you're not already in our Slack community, I definitely recommend it. There is a link to join the community in the description of every past office hours video. So when this video is up as a recording on YouTube, it will have a link, but any of the past days office hours always have that link to join up in Slack. So I host the show Monday through Friday here, so the last show of the week at 2 p.m. Eastern, and once a week we are using this time here for what we've been calling a strategy session, where we do a deep dive into a specific sport or concept or topic area or whatever really feels relevant for that particular week. And yesterday, Danny was on with me here, and we were talking a little bit of MLB DFS weather strategy. So I know weather has been a bit of a pain the last 2 weeks to navigate, a little bit tricky. So we were talking how to find accurate information and make smart decisions about navigating weather games in baseball DFS, but also how to use some of SaberSim's unique tools regarding late swap and editing exposures and ownership projections and things like that to actually find a way to get a little bit of an edge out of navigating weather in baseball DFS. So, of course, yesterday was a full slate of gorgeous weather games, no weather concerns whatsoever, and it looks like today is going to be a bit similar. So that certainly makes the games, the slates, a little bit less stressful to play. As a DFS player, that's definitely nice, a little bit unfortunate timing for our strategy session, of course, but I know the weather games are not going anywhere. They'll probably be back soon. So as soon as we have that next slate where there are 4+ weather games to deal with on the slate and everybody is asking questions about that, I will direct everybody back to that video. So we will wait for that. But if you've been playing a lot of baseball DFS, all of our content in the past now almost 6 weeks has been heavily baseball focused. So all those strategy sessions are up on the YouTube channel as well. They have a playlist for those. I've been tucking a few of my favorites or some of the most relevant ones into the descriptions of most of our videos that we've been putting out lately. So check those out if you're playing baseball DFS. Really, it's just been awesome conversations we've been having here on the strategy sessions with Max and Matt and Will and Danny here and Andy and Chris was on too. So really, a bunch of the different SaberSim guys have been on here talking a little bit of baseball strategy. So it's been a lot of fun. Those videos are all up. Anyway, I will go ahead and quit rambling here. We have a handful of questions to go through today. I got a very strong set of questions from a user through email here. Some very nuanced, some questions with some complexity associated with them. So we'll start breaking those down, and then we will jump into it. Jim said, thanks for all your help. Won my first tournament last night, turned $3 into $150. That is amazing, man. I'm glad it was helpful. I know we had some good conversation going on yesterday in the baseball channel here. It sounds like it's been a pretty profitable week for the both of us here. So congratulations. Keep it up. That is a hell of an ROI. What is that? 50x? So pretty impressive stuff. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into questions, right? So I prepped my app here ahead of time today. I'm sure you guys will all be proud of me that I don't have to spend time doing that on stream. So we've got the app pulled up, and let's go ahead and start getting into the questions here. So I mentioned these all came in from Jackie in our email inbox, and there are a few different questions here. So we will just handle these one at a time. And really, just really strong questions here too. So I'm excited to talk about some of these. Okay, so question 1 from Jackie. If I've come up with desired individual player exposures for the entire player pool, should I be setting the ownership slider to 0 if I do not want that to be a factor? This is an interesting question, and I think some of this relates to the strategy session we did now a few weeks ago where we talked about the 5 styles of winning DFS players. This really kind of gets at, there's one end goal that we all have when we're building our lineups, and those are to build well-correlated, high upside, well-leveraged lineups for the contest that we're playing in, right? And then there's a lot of ways to kind of go about getting there. We talk about users that maybe prefer to use the stack rule versus using correlation. And there's users that maybe find it very intuitive to edit projections, and some like to edit exposures. And that was kind of what that video was getting at. So I will say 2 things here. One, kind of cautionary, if you are new to SaberSim or are still getting familiar with the tool overall, I would say definitely be cautious turning ownership fades off. Maybe I would say experiment with running builds with it at the default setting and then off to see how your exposures change. However, in this particular email, Jackie is coming across pretty confident about where these individual player exposures are. If you are running your test builds and you have a strong idea of where the chalk is going to be, you have a strong idea of where you want to differentiate from the chalk and find some leverage on the field, I definitely know that there are players out there that are very successful turning ownership fade off, running their builds, and basically managing their ownership on their own. Right. So maybe identifying what the chalky stacks are going to be and limiting your exposure to certain players like that, or pitchers, or pumping up minimum exposure to some of the lower owned plays and getting a lineup portfolio that you are comfortable with. Right. So in a lot of ways, these are 2 different paths to the same goal. I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way. If you are very confident in your exposure editings and you overall feel like you are using the right amount of leverage that is appropriate for the contest you're playing, I think it does make a lot of sense then to turn ownership fade off, run a build that is ownership agnostic, and then adjust your exposures from there, right? So say the chalky pitchers are going to be Musgrove and Cole, so maybe you're taking maybe you're just fading those guys, right? Like the 2 chalkiest pitchers, and you're playing Peralta and Wheeler and other guys like this. And Washington's going to be chalky tonight, so maybe you're taking like an underweight stance on Washington or something like this. I think LA is actually going to be pretty chalky too. But maybe you're going in and doing this, and now you're getting some lower owned teams, things like that. So I think this works. I don't think there's anything wrong with going this route. So, but just be aware that you are kind of, you're taking, the sliders kind of provide you a little bit of like a security blanket backstop. You know that at least the lineups you're getting were built with a certain amount of ownership fade. When you turn it off, you take that off. So just be careful and make sure that you are editing exposures in a way that gives you enough leverage on the field for the contest you're playing. But great question. I see some other questions are trickling in here. I'm going to go ahead and rip through my little queue of questions I have here, and then we'll make sure we get to everything today. And then, okay, so let's see the next one here. So another question from email. It says, additionally, I've read the FAQ on smart diversity, just having a hard time rationalizing how different it is from randomness. Normally, I do not like to factor in any randomness. Not that it doesn't happen, but my risk tolerance is, I assume probably that maybe assessed in my exposure. So should this be set to 0 too? So this is one where I would say I highly, highly, highly encourage you to never turn smart diversity off when you are running builds for GPP contests. I would say actually, I would recommend never even turning it lower than it is for the defaults. Originally, when I read this question, I actually thought it said having a hard time rationalizing how it is different from randomness. So I was prepared to talk about how it is different. So, and maybe I will still do that, maybe just to be helpful for those that don't totally know. Now I'm realizing this as just having a hard time rationalizing how different it is. So, but let's talk about how it is different here, just in case people are not entirely aware. Because smart diversity in many ways, I think, is like the flagship feature, or really like probably the most amazing part of what SaberSim is really doing for you. So let's look at a guy like Ohtani, right? And his mean projection tonight is 11.31. What that means is that across the entire database of game simulations we have for his game tonight, across all of these different outcomes that he scores in all of these game simulations, the mathematical average, the total number of points scored divided by the total number of simulations, is 11.31, right? But we can see that he is not normally distributed, and most baseball hitters are not normally distributed, right? His most common outcome is actually 0, significantly so. He has extremely high upside outcomes, and there's this kind of decreasing trend here in his range of outcomes, right? So what randomness does, a traditional optimizer's randomness, is an attempt to introduce diversity and variance into your lineups, but it makes a terrible assumption that all players are normally distributed. So a normally distributed player means that their range of outcomes looks like a bell curve, and that their likelihood of scoring, the assumption there is that their likelihood of scoring 20% under their mean outcome is the same as their likelihood of scoring 20% over their mean outcome. Now, you can see that's very much not the truth for someone like, and typically, actually, the other thing I will add is that they're in a normally distributed curve, their mean outcome is, I think, almost always, or maybe 100% of the time, their most common outcome, right? You can see this is just simply not the case for someone like Ohtani, right? Most common outcome is 0. It's definitely not equally likely that he scores 5 as he does. Well, maybe that's not a good example. That he scores 0 as he does 20, right? Hitters are not normally distributed. So what smart diversity is doing instead is it still allows you to find some variance and diversity in your lineups. But the way it works is the higher it is, the smaller the random bucket of game simulations, the smaller the random. So let me start over, because I want to make sure I explain this correctly. The scale of smart diversity from 0 to 10 here, the higher the number is, the smaller the total number of game simulations we randomly pick from to determine each player's projection as we're building each lineup, right? So it's easiest noticed at 10 because we're using single game simulations at 10. So we will take a single game simulation for each game on the slate, use the projections that a player scored in that game, and those will be the projections that are used to build one single lineup. Then we'll go to the next lineup, use a single game simulation, and then as you move, I guess, left from 10, this would then just be a very small bucket of simulations. So maybe there's a small handful of game simulations. So in some ways, it approaches starting to get closer to the average, but it's still allowing for the upside of players to shine through, right? So, I mean, if you're thinking someone like Ohtani here, right? Say you were using a traditional optimizer with 20% randomness, that would essentially assume that his range of outcomes was 80% of 11.31. So let's do that times 0.8. So from 9.05 or so to 120% to 13.5, right? So if you're using a traditional optimizer with traditional randomness and you set a 20% randomness, you would assume Ohtani's outcomes were from roughly 9 to 13.5. But this is actually what his range of outcomes looks like. And using smart diversity and using typically high levels of smart diversity allows you to actually build lineups that take into account these real ranges of outcomes, not just made up ranges of outcomes intended to artificially boost the diversity of your lineups, right? This increases diversity by actually looking at real ranges of outcomes. And every game on the slate's only going to get played one time, right? So it's important to know what players' actual floors and ceilings are. So that's how valuable this is. So it's also, I guess, kind of to summarize here, I would definitely not turn it off, right? I think it's important to leave it on. It allows you to capture the upside of players when you're building your lineups. If you are a player that uses a traditional optimizer and doesn't like to use randomness, I think that's true of a lot of players. When I used to use, before I found SaberSim, when I used to use traditional optimizers, I wouldn't use randomness either. I didn't like what it did. I was aware of the problems that it presented that we've talked about here. Definitely explore using smart diversity and I would say, don't move it lower than what the defaults are for the contest you're playing. And you can take advantage of editing exposures in step 3 to limit your pool of players and tighten up or widen your player pool accordingly, to dial in the overall like diversity of your lineups while still allowing the benefits of smart diversity to shine through, right? So like, for example, if you typically played with 0 or low randomness and you played a very tight player pool, you can do that here and just edit and remove players and maybe tighten up to a core of 4 pitchers or something like that here, right? We're playing a tighter player pool now, while still knowing that the lineups were built by looking at players' real ranges of outcomes and taking advantage of smart diversity. So it is an amazing tool. It is an extremely valuable tool. I would not turn it off. And if anyone still has kind of follow-up questions, we talk about smart diversity regularly here on the show. I think that's great. I think it's an important concept. I think it's one that maybe isn't always immediately intuitive until it's kind of been broken down for you. So I'm always happy to answer more questions or some more follow-up about the way smart diversity works and the value add that it provides. So, but okay, cool. I think I have one other question here from email. So we'll go ahead and jump to this one. Okay. This question says, lastly, I really like the correlation slider as it takes the guesswork out of which players correlate best with each other. I normally like a stack rule of at least 2 players for MLB, but when using that rule, it occasionally cannot build lineups. By removing that rule, it always works correctly for the most part. How necessary is that stack rule if correlation of players is also factored by projection? Like if batter 4 is highly projected today and so is batter 6, I assume the lineup builder would already be factoring that, thus not needing a stack rule. A lot to unpack here. I would say broad strokes, right? I agree here that typically you can get the stacks that you need just by relying on the correlation slider. Let's go back to this test build we ran. And we can see that we ran this build for 20 max, 10,000 to 50,000 type contest. We can hover over here and see what our correlation value was. Oops, give this a second to come back here. So our correlation was at 8. And if we look at stack types, we're getting 5 3s, 4 4s, 4 3s, and 5 2s, right? Like the exact kinds of stacks that you typically want to play in baseball DFS. I would say broad strokes in general, for the average user here, you really probably don't need to set a stack rule. I would say even if you get to the end here and maybe there is a small bit of lineup stack types that you don't really like, maybe for whatever reason you don't want to play a 4-3, again, you can just eliminate some of these lineups here and narrow it in using the post-build exposure settings. If you know for a fact that you want to get a certain stack type, so maybe you just know from the start you only want 5 stacks, right? I think you can go in here and set the rule to say at least 5 players from the same team, and do that. I would say the main use case here is if you just know, even before you run the build, that you're going to eliminate any lineups that don't fit into a particular stack type. I think you can just set the manual stack rule ahead of time and just know that you're going to be working with a full pool of lineups that fit the stack types you want. For this particular question here, a stacking rule of at least 2 players for baseball, I don't think you need to set that rule. I find it odd that you said that sometimes it can't build lineups. The only situation I can imagine that coming up is if you had maybe locked or excluded a lot of players in step 1 and somehow set yourself a prohibitive like combination where, I don't know, maybe you've excluded all batters except from 1 from a certain team and then locked in that batter and set a minimum 2 stacking rule. Like that might create a situation where lineups are struggling to be built. But 2 players per team is such a small minor stack. I would say you're likely to get much larger stacks than that out of the box and just be good to go. I don't think you need to set a minimum 2 stack rule. I would say really, I was actually talking in the baseball channel earlier this week about the way I ran a certain build that ended up leading to me taking down the Minimax earlier this week. And in that build, I had set a minimum 4 stacking rule. And that is mostly because I was running my test builds and seeing that I was getting lineups that had 2-2-2s or 3-2-2s or lineup constructions that I just didn't want to play. So I went back and set a minimum 4 stacking rule just so I know that I would get a portfolio that looked more like this. And I did, right? That's a better use case, I think, if you know that there's a certain construction, particularly I would say maybe 3, really probably 4 or 5 is the most useful cases for doing this. Or if you know even more specifically than that, right? If you've already decided I'm only playing 5-3, you can even set that, right? You can set one rule that says use 5 players and another rule that says use 3 and just be done, and you're only going to get 5 3s. This isn't how I particularly play. I like my stacks being a little bit more open than this, but I know some users like to play just straight 5 3s, so you can do that too. So in summary, I think correlation slider is going to handle the vast majority of this for you. I think there were a few other couple interesting notes here. Jackie mentioned here that seeing this actually quantified here and seeing just how correlated one player is to another is really useful. I completely agree. We talk about that a lot on stream here today, especially in sports that have complicated correlations. Like NBA, correlations on the average are generally low, but it can be sometimes not always intuitive to know if a player is correlated with one another. It can be very useful there. And then the last note here, if batter 4 is highly projected and so is batter 6, I'd assume that the lineup builder would already be factoring that, thus not needing a stack rule. It does in some components of like actually just, valuing the correlation of those 2 players. If 2 players are already highly projected and they're correlated with another, it just gives the builder even a greater reason to want to use those 2 players together. But smart diversity also can help with this a little bit too, right? Like as we go further to the right here and we approach single game simulations, or even if we're at just like 9 and using very small buckets, right? You start to isolate down to such a small number of game simulations that let's say you're looking at a game simulation where Ohtani goes 4 for 4 and hits 2 home runs, right? All of those failures to get out, all of those at-bats created additional at-bats for his teammates. And maybe you have single game simulations where Upton and Walsh and Stassi also have good games, right? You will have those players more likely to come into the lineups because they have high projections in the game simulations that you've randomly binned together via smart diversity, and they may be more likely to show up in the lineup as well. So smart diversity and correlation can kind of work together a little bit in that way, and I think that's kind of what this comment is getting at here. So but I think that covers these 3 questions from Jackie. Very sharp stuff overall, very nuanced questions. I'm glad I had an opportunity to walk through some of that. We had an opportunity to chat about all 3 sliders as well, which is great. We chatted first about ownership fade, then then smart diversity, and then correlation, of course. So great questions. If anyone has any follow-up or some confusion there in general, happy to dive back into some of those. So, but great questions here. Let's see. Parker asked a really good question. Is it possible to add a stack that isn't currently listed? For example, if I wanted more 4-2-2, but none were listed, or 3-3-2. There is a way to do this, and it's a little bit of a roundabout solution here, but I'll show you how you can kind of handle how you can do this. So I'm going to actually start with a new test build because I realized that original test build was 0 ownership fade. I want to do this as like a true... I'm going to do this as a true default settings build. So let's go ahead actually and let me lower the projections here so we can actually see the lineups when this runs. And we'll talk about this here in a moment. So yeah, I mentioned this is a little bit of a roundabout solution. Maybe it's kind of a workaround almost, but it does work. And we're looking at ways in a future update as we're retooling the visual front end of the app here to make this a little bit more easier, a little bit more intuitive for users. But we can talk about the easiest way to do this in just a moment after this build finishes up here. So we'll just give this a moment. All right. Okay, so we have default settings test build. Okay, so we'll go to our stack types, right? So in this case, I wonder, did I have a stacking rule set? No, I didn't. So we literally just got only two stack types, 5-3 and 5-2, right? Really nice big stacks. One thing you can do is expand the size of your pool. You don't want to expand it too big, because if you expand it too big, you lose your ability to filter. But I think typically like 40% of the entire pool or something like that. Oh, I always do that. Okay. So one thing that's very easy to do is you can expand your pool and say, instead of looking at the top 20, I want to look at the top 200 or so. And you're just going to see a ton more lineup types show up, right? Because we just have way more lineups in there. So this is a very useful way if you are either not seeing this team that you wanted originally, right? Like first, let's look how few teams there are here when we're looking at 20 lineups, right? Only, what is that? 9 teams stacked. And maybe there's a team that you wanted to stack here, or a stack type that you wanted to use that you don't see. You can expand this up, look at your top 200 instead. And then all of a sudden you're going to get access to like all of these other teams. So maybe you were surprised that you weren't seeing any Houston and you wanted to play at least just a little bit of Houston. And you can say 20 or something like that. You are typically going to see this message. It's okay. It's because we have 200 lineups open, so we'll just leave it. Same thing here. Then maybe say, so what was it? 3-2-2s and 4-2-2s. So maybe we wanted 10% 3-2-2s. And 10% 4-2-2s, right? Again, we're okay with this message right now because we're viewing a pool of 200, right? So we don't need to say yes. Now we can go ahead and just drop this back down to 20. It'll keep our minimum exposures, but it should even everything out nicely, right? Now that we only have 20 lineups again, everything will look the way we want it. So that's the easiest way to do that, is if you're not seeing the teams or the stack types you want right out of the gate, expand your pool, look at a bigger section of your pool, maybe the top 200 or the top 40%, depending on how many lineups you actually built, and then set a minimum rule. Don't worry if you see a message saying you need to build more lineups. That's only because you're playing with so many, right? And then you can bring it back down to 20 and get them back. It's almost like opening your pool up, reaching in for the team stacks and the stack types you want, pulling them out, and then dropping the pool back down. And I know that's not super intuitive, and it's definitely not something that I think you might look at this and just be like, oh yeah, that's obviously how I do this. So we are looking at ways with players. We have this checkbox that says show all players, and it will just show your entire pool. And it's very, very easy to just go grab any player that you didn't get a lot of exposure to. Maybe we want like one Teoscar Hernandez lineup for some reason. I don't know. It's very easy to just go in and set that minimum exposure, and then all of a sudden you're getting your one Teoscar Hernandez lineup. Stack types, unfortunately, at the moment don't work that way. Neither do team stacks. And we're exploring ways that we can add that in the future. Trying to figure out the easiest way to do that. It does get a little bit more complicated because we have all these different stack types, right? Or these different sized team stacks. There's a little bit of complexity there. There is a ton of different available stack types. So looking at ways we can do that, but great question. It's come up before, so hopefully that was helpful. Parker, let me know if you still have any follow-up there for me. Jim said I'd ask for a dark mode option. It's kind of hard for us old guys to read. I will say that is very close. So good news there. Should be shipping along with a pretty large overall visual update. So stay tuned for that. We are urgently trying to get that out here before football season. Coming up quick on us, but that is very much so in the works. So. Cool. And then Jim also said, can you go over the thing you were talking about the other day regarding the stack sizes based on the size of slate and contest? Like the larger the slate, the more you should stack or something similar. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think the easiest place to start, right, is actually to look at different slate sizes and see what we're seeing with the correlation slider, right? So we're on a 14-game slate tonight, and default sliders for something like the quarter jukebox correlation is at 8, very high. Let's go look at the 7-game turbo slate. And remember, these sliders are back tested against real contests to determine which sliders create the lineups that have the highest expected value. So these are data driven, in other words, right? We can use these to draw conclusions from. Now we're on a 7-game slate, right? Same size contest, correlation comes down to 6. 4-game slate. Correlation comes down to 3, right? So correlation is going down as the size of the slate goes down. Now let's go back to our 14-game slate. And let's look at contest size, right? Now this one probably will not move as dramatically, but let's look at what happens as we move down in contest size. So let's say, does it move at all? It's not moving. Let's see if we can switch to. Okay. This isn't really as much having the impact that I wanted with contest size. Okay, that's fine. So now let's talk about kind of the theory behind this, right? So we saw that correlation goes down as the size of the slate goes down. There's a practical reason for that. I'll get into that in a moment, but there's kind of a theory side of this overall, right? So if we run builds with sliders at 0, 0, 10, let's just run a couple because I don't want to take up too much time. This is going to essentially turn correlation off, right? Turn stacking pretty much off completely, turn ownership off completely, and use single game simulations of each game on the slate to basically give us a handful of builds that are like mathematical optimals for that slate that night. And what we are going to see is that these are probably going to look very different than what you would expect, or what the lineups that look like are that are actually going to win the contests that night are going to look. And the reason why is because there is a difference typically between the mathematical optimal, which, let's see these stack types, are not going to be very stacked, right? There's 14 games on the slate. The idea that the perfectly mathematical optimal is going to be a 5-3 stack is actually kind of low, right? A lot of times you get lineups that look a little bit more like these, right? So there is a lone 4 stack of 75 different optimals, but a lot of them don't have stacks at all. The 13% of them literally have no stacks, right? Because there's so many players on the slate, the mathematical optimals don't always look very stacked. So correlation is very much a tool that we use in baseball DFS that makes it easier to win our contests, right? Because instead of picking 10 independent events, 10 different players in the lineup, if we stack 5 of them together, those players are correlated. The success of one is correlated with another, right? One hitter's positive outcomes increases the likelihood that other hitters' positive outcomes happen. And it basically increases the likelihood that we are correct about the entire lineup as a whole, and the entire lineup succeeds well. But it doesn't necessarily mean that lineup is going to approach the mathematical optimal. So now getting into this comment here of why then do we want to stack more on larger slates, and why do we want to stack more on larger slates and stack more on smaller contests? It's because on larger slates and in smaller contests, the lineups that win those contests are further away from the optimal, right? And that should make sense with our intuition. If there are 14 baseball games on a slate, it is very hard for DFS players to build lineups that are mathematically optimal. This is a very hard lineup for someone to build when there are 300 batters and 28 pitchers to choose from. 300 batters might be a little much. I feel like that's too high. Let's say it's 8.5 times 14 times 2. 238 batters in theory on tonight's slate, and 28 pitchers, right? It's very hard to build the mathematical optimal. So the lineups that win typical contests on a slate like this aren't going to approach the optimal, most likely. Now, on a 2-game slate, it's very likely that someone might be able to, or a 3-game slate, it's much more likely that someone might be able to build an optimal, right? Or a 3-game slate where there are 100,000 lineups in the contest. The top lineup overall in that contest is probably going to be very close to the mathematical optimal, because there's so many lineups and there's so few players in the pool that almost just from like a random variance component, someone's probably going to land on optimal lineups. So when the winning lineup for a certain contest is likely to approach the optimal, we theoretically want to be willing, I guess, to stack a little bit less, because we need to take into account these what optimal lineups typically look like. So Jim said, so large slate, small contest should be stacked more than a large slate, large contest. Yes. But I think yes, I think so in broad terms. I don't think this needs to be something that we are obsessive over, right? And the builder is going to handle a lot of this for you, right? Like that's why we see these changes in the sliders. And you can see on a slate like this, right? It actually doesn't even look like the sliders change that much from going from 1,000 to 50,000 entries in terms of correlation. So perhaps the size of the contest is not a huge factor here comparatively. But the slate size is. It's like going down to a slate half the size does drop correlation down to 6. And that may not dramatically impact the stack sizes you get. And here's where I said the practical side, right? Because when you have less teams on the slate, in some ways, the correlation slider coming down a little bit is outweighed by the total number of teams on the slate coming down. So your stack sizes may not overly change that much, but this is very much on the theory side of things of like overall correlation theory. Jim said, if the builder handles it, then I'm good. I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah, if you're listening to me here and you're maybe a little bit unfamiliar with SaberSim or still kind of getting used to it, and you're like, what is this guy talking about? This is like very much on the theory or like maybe even like an academic side of DFS here. Our builder is kind of built to equip this. It will build the right stack sizes for you automatically if you leave the correlation slider alone. This is just kind of thinking about like why we stack the way we do and why certain contests we want, theoretically, we might want bigger stacks, and certain contests we might want smaller stacks, right? I know like on a slate like tonight, I might experiment with a stacking rule just to force a certain size of stacks into my lineups, because on a 14-game slate, it's going to be almost impossible for people to land on the optimal. I want to rely heavily on stacking to correlate my lineups as much as possible. So, but definitely, again, this is like very much, I love talking about this stuff, this theory side stuff. But on the practical side, you don't think you need to overly sweat this too much. The builder and the natural correlation sliders set at their defaults are going to take care of a lot of this. So, let's jump to Parker's question here, because it's also about stacking. And he said, I'm new to DFS MLB. I've noticed that stacking multiple players from the same team is the norm. I like to check the perfect lineups from the day before, and I noticed they never have more than 2 players. This is the perfect question on the same team. As a new player, where does the stacking 4 to 5 players on a team come from? Okay, so Parker, I think I kind of covered a little bit of this here a second ago in the previous question, but I might have gone a little bit fast because I didn't see this question. So let's kind of talk about this, right? So we literally just saw this, right? By running our build we just did. So we ran our build with the sliders at 0, 0, 10, right? That's using 0 correlation and seeing what the optimals look like. And we saw, right, exactly as you've seen in your research, 2 players from the same team, 2 players from one team and 2 players from another, 3 players from the same team, no players from the same team, 3 and 2, right? So these look different than maybe what you see typical skilled DFS players do in baseball. And the reason why is because it's very hard to build this lineup and to build the lineup that actually wins. Because what you essentially have to do is be right about this guy who has a wide range of outcomes, a very wide range of outcomes. You need to be right that his ceiling outcome occurs. You need to be right that this guy's ceiling outcome occurs, right? And so on. You're trying to pick 10 independent events, all having their maybe 5% outcome all at once, right? Mathematically, that's very hard to do. We can actually even quantify that, right? We're trying to get every single player's 95th percentile outcome. So we have 0.5 to the 10th, right? That's essentially the likelihood of what we're trying to pick. I didn't actually end up calculating it, but it's very hard. And you can see very quickly why that's very hard. What correlation does is it means that one player's positive outcome, their ceiling outcome, means that another player's ceiling outcome is more likely, right? And that's why we stack. So when we actually build our traditional lineups and we look at one of our lineups that is maybe like a 5-3. Let's look at a 5-3. We'll give this a second here to catch back up. We build lineups that look like these, typically in baseball DFS, because it means we're suddenly not picking, I guess just even as the batters, we're suddenly not picking 8 individual events, right? When we play 5 Washington batters together, Trey Turner's ceiling outcome, where he scores 30 points because he went 5 for 5 or something like that, gives all of these other Washington hitters more at-bats, more chances, and greater likelihood that their ceiling outcomes or positive outcomes occur. And we can actually quantify that, right? We see that Trey Turner, for example, has these coefficients of correlation with players in his lineup, right? And it makes us know that, again, when we're trying to win a GPP, we're looking for ceiling outcomes. And this gives us some lineup. I feel like I'm using the word correlation too much when trying to talk about why correlation is important. But it gives us some lineup correlation of that ceiling outcome, right? One player's ceiling outcome means it's more likely that another player's ceiling outcome occurs. So that's why we do it, right? Because it means that we can build lineups that have a greater overall chance of success of succeeding together, and then therefore like winning our contests. We can make a prediction about the state of the Washington team overall rather than trying to identify Turner's lone ceiling outcome. So, and that's kind of what I was referring to in the previous question, right? As the conditions become better for picking the optimal lineup by either having a smaller player pool, so a smaller slate, or by having way more lineups in the pool, the optimal stack sizes get smaller because whoever's going to win that contest is going to get closer to what the actual just random optimal lineup is. They had less players to choose from. They had way more lineups to do it. So the optimal is probably going to be maybe a little bit smaller stacked. Sorry, the winning contest is probably going to be a little bit smaller stacked. It's going to approach the optimal. So, but Parker said, makes sense. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I'm glad those last couple questions we were able to kind of tackle together. They paired very nicely together. So cool. I know there was a question here that from Slack that I missed earlier. This is from Safo or Safo. If you're watching, let me know how to pronounce that. I know we've been chatting a little bit here in the MLB channel this week. I'm never really sure how to pronounce this, but he said, is there a close all builds button? I assume you're talking about these builds up top. There isn't, unfortunately, and I can see maybe why that might be useful. I will say the one thing is, you don't really need to clean these out, I would say, unless you have a ton of them. I don't really think like there's any. I typically leave my old builds here. We don't really have a way to clear all at the moment, unfortunately. I know once you have so many that the new build button ends up getting pushed over to the right, that can be a little annoying. We're going to be fixing that particular problem here in a future update, the same update actually with some of these other things coming out. So I know that's a little bit annoying, but there isn't, unfortunately, a way to do that at the moment. So, but good question and a good idea overall. We are here sitting at about 43 and a half minutes so far. Any other questions? Oh, yep, there is another question. Missed this one. From Talut. Is adjusting the percentile a good idea for building lineups, or is average the best way to go? I would say you don't really need to adjust percentiles to find success using SaberSim. Because of the way smart diversity works, again, I for the people that have been watching the whole day here, I'm not going to completely re-summarize this, but if you're unfamiliar with smart diversity, I talked a lot about it at the start of the show, but I will say quickly, the way smart diversity works is it accounts for upside by using small random bins of game simulations. So using players' real ranges of outcomes to basically allow natural upside games to show up in your pool, right? So like Freddie Peralta, his 85th and 95th and 75th and the ceiling outcomes show up when you randomly pull game simulations and put them into a bucket and then to use that player's projection to build a lineup. That's what smart diversity does. Those percentile outcomes naturally show up in your lineup. So when you end up building your pool at average percentile and you have 25% Freddie for Peralta, in some ways you're getting like you're getting how often his ceiling outcomes are optimal in DFS is quantified in some ways, that it's 25% of the time. So it's already kind of getting taken into account for you. I think where percentiles can be most useful is if you're researching and you want to see how players different 85th percentile outcomes stack up together. We've talked about some of the ways that you can use this as a research tool in the past. I will link those past office hours in the description of this video when it's up as a recording. It's come up before. I won't have enough time to go as deep as I did in the past, but one thing you can see, especially when you're looking at the hitters, is that players and teams that are further apart at the average outcome get closer together at the ceiling outcome. So the best hitting teams on the night, the teams that traditional optimizers are likely to value highly, and even maybe SaberSim is likely to value highly, are much further apart from the worst hitting teams on the slate at the average outcome than they are at the ceiling outcome. And you can look at that by seeing how different players compare at average versus 85th percentile, right? But do you need to use it to build your lineups? I don't think you need to. We're actually talking about ways to change this here to make this look less like click me and do something with me button and more of just a research tool, because that's really the best way it can be used. But it won't have a dramatic impact on your builds. I would say typically we don't really recommend that users need to move this around. If you want to, you can do it prior to your build, or you can do it also after your build has run. Or let's go back to the 1224 one. You can edit it up here. We'll let this come back up here. It won't dramatically update your exposures. So we can see this here. Well, let's give this a second to catch back up. Okay, so it typically won't dramatically update your exposures, but if we change it from average to 85th, for example, it will slightly weight your lineups towards plays that maybe have a little bit of a higher upside. Again, not a dramatic change. Peralta and Turner and actually, okay, so now it looks like Cole's coming up. So Cole maybe has a little bit higher upside at his 85th percentile outcome than Peralta, but a lot of the same players are still showing up. It's a way to maybe add a little bit more upside, but definitely not like a necessity. I use it in my process more as a research tool, as a way to kind of see how different teams' ceiling outcomes look like together, how the best teams on the slate's ceiling outcomes compare to maybe more middle of the road looking teams by team total. That's the way I think it's the most useful. I don't think it's a necessary part of the process. I run my actual builds almost always on average percentile. So the last way, since we have time here, I don't see any other questions that come in. I'll go back here. I guess I'll have to let this thing spin again here. So sorry about that. But the last thing that I think it is very useful for is it can give you a little bit of an idea of what you are asking of a lineup, basically, or what you need from a lineup. And it can be kind of useful for that purpose too. So we're looking at our top lineup here, right? If this lineup on the whole scores their 85th percentile outcome, this lineup gives you 213 points, right? It's not our highest scoring lineup because we're sorted by Saber score instead here. But it's kind of useful to just look. And especially as you get really familiar with if you've been playing a certain site, baseball DFS, for a while, you get kind of familiar with what top scores look like. And you can kind of start asking yourself okay, so for this lineup to be successful, Garrett Cole and Peralta need to score 37 points. And I'm asking for 18 through all of my hitters. And obviously this isn't how lineups that actually win end up looking. Like if Gary Sanchez hits 2 home runs and scores 36 or something like that, somebody else doesn't need to score 18. But it does give you like an idea of what, like quantified, what actual fantasy points get scored at this outcome. What are these lineups expected to score at their 85th percentile outcome, and so on. So that can be kind of useful too. But I like 85th percentile outcome to use as a research tool in general, whether I'm doing it in step 3 post build or in step 1 pre build. I like 85th percentile outcome. I think it in general kind of lands at approximately like the numbers that I think are reasonable for thinking about a ceiling. It's what happens 15% of the time or less. It's not so as extreme as a 95th percentile outcome. This is 5% or less of the time. You're talking about pretty rare outcomes for each individual player. In some ways, I think 95th percentile outcomes can be thought of a bit as a player's like absolute ceilings. If players were normally distributed, this would be approximately 2 standard deviations away from their means. We are really talking about pretty impressive, especially on the pitching, pretty high scores overall, extremely inflated projected scores. These 95th percentile outcomes across an entire lineup would probably win any contest that night most of the time. This is almost overkill, I think, on a lineup level for what is likely to win a contest. I think 85th percentile outcomes are very much typically in line with what like the typical winning score might look like on a slate. Obviously, it's not an exact science. If all the chalk goes off, the winning scores are going to be really high. If all the chalk busts, the winning scores are going to be pretty low. I won with a 157 earlier this week. Like, you don't necessarily need 213 points every night. But it depends on the contest too. But I like 85th for visualizing ceilings. But hopefully that was questionable. Hopefully it wasn't questionable. Hopefully it was helpful. But again, I think in summary here, I think percentiles are most useful as a research tool. Definitely not a requirement to get upside in your lineups. Smart diversity takes care of most of that for you. So, but very good question. Get a lot of questions about percentiles. So always happy to talk about that. All right, guys, it is 12:52 here at my local time. Happy to chat as long as there are questions still coming through. We've covered some interesting topics here today. All over the place. We talked about really all 3 sliders independently. We've talked about smart diversity a couple times. We've talked about some correlation theory. We've talked about percentiles, all very interesting things. If you've been listening along and something didn't totally sit right with you, a little confused, didn't really make sense, now's a great time to ask, right? That's the whole reason we do this live. I don't want anyone to leave here feeling like they didn't get a question answered or they heard something that maybe confused them a little bit further or wasn't totally clear. I'm sitting up here alone. I'm not hearing my own voice necessarily, I guess. Sometimes I watch these videos back after I hop off every single day and timestamp them and write a nice description and title so that YouTube likes us. And sometimes I listen to them back and I think, that wasn't exactly what I was trying to say, or that wasn't really exactly the way I would have explained that if I had a second time to do it. So I know there's got to be a few of you guys out there that this is happening to too, where answering a question and it just something sounds a little weird or doesn't exactly sound the way that, or doesn't really make sense. So we covered a lot today. We covered some kind of complicated questions. If you guys have any follow-up, anything that was confusing, it is a great time to ask. We'll give it a few minutes here. I've had a great show here today. Thank you again for everyone that has tuned in and watched live here. Always great to have a show with some awesome engagement and some questions. So appreciate everybody that is joining in here. While we have a little bit of time, something that I don't always necessarily say often enough on here, if you are watching this and you haven't tried out SaberSim yet, and our approach to handling correlation and ownership fade and upside in the form of our smart diversity tool is appealing to you and it sounds interesting, and it sounds like a step up from your traditional optimizer, it probably is. We have a free 7-day trial on our site. You can come and try our tools for free for a full 7 days. In baseball season, everybody knows just how much that is, right? That is quite a bit of a value. You'll have 7 or so main slates and all of the showdowns and mini slates and things like that in between there. You can see we support all of these different game types, all of these different slate types. We support them in full with full projections and ownership projections for every slate that is out there. So in 7 days of a free trial, you can try a lot. So SaberSim.com is where to go. You'll see a message as soon as you hit the site pretty quickly. Start my free trial. Boom. You get signed up. This is going to redirect me back to the app here in just a moment. But free trial for 7 days, no strings attached. So if you're watching this, again, either live as a recording, stumbled upon this here and find this interesting, come check us out. So, all right, guys, I don't see any other questions trickling in here. Again, thank you for everybody that spent some time here with me today. It is Friday, so we will be off from office hours for the weekend, back again on Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So come join me. If you have questions that come up over the course of the weekend, feel free to pop them into Slack, the office hours channel, or email us, support@sabersim.com, and we will get your questions answered on Monday's stream. Again, next week as well, we will be doing another strategy session, typically Wednesday or Thursday, probably some baseball-related content. So look forward to that. Enjoy the slate tonight and throughout the weekend. Hopefully the weather stays nice for these games, but as soon as it doesn't, if you haven't already checked it out, watch the dealing with weather in MLB DFS video that we put out yesterday. Be super helpful as soon as we have some rain to worry about here again. But I'll stop rambling, let everybody get back to their day. Thanks again. See you guys on Monday. Take care.